Hey guys, thanks a lot for clicking on the video. As you can tell by the thumbnail, today we're going to take a look at 15 of the worst Super Nintendo games. One of the greatest video game libraries in my personal opinion, and my favorite console if you couldn't figure it out from the name of the channel. However, just because it's regarded by myself and many others as one of, if not the best system, it doesn't mean that it didn't have a few stinkers. Now, today we're going to take a look at 15 of them. Now, of course, these are my picks, along with a little help from several articles dedicated to today's topic. As always, I would love to hear from you down in the comments. Whether you agree or not, I'd love to read what your thoughts are on the subject. And in the interest of not pissing off that one Batman Forever fan, these games won't be ranked, simply numbered 1 to 15. And without any further ado, let's get started. Starting us off at number 1, Shak Fu. We all knew that this game was going to show up somewhere on this list, so I figured let's get it out of the way right away. Now, I know Shak Fu gets shit on by a lot of people, and it isn't a good game because it's on this list, but it's not horrible. I mean, it does play, it does work. The control is bad, the input is bad, the story is really dumb and convoluted. The sprites look okay. I mean, like, there is enough nostalgia for it to get that 2018 remake, which wasn't that much better, but, you know, this game was going to show up on the list. We all knew it. It deserves to be on this list as one of the 15 worst games, but it's not, you know, compared to some of the other ones on here, it's not the worst. And, I mean, you have to think back in 1994, like, Shaq was everywhere. With the draft, going to the Magic, his rap career, all the movies that he was in, you know, why would he say no to a video game? Like, I wouldn't say no to a video game. It just didn't turn out that great.
On your mark.
Number 2, Nickelodeon Guts. Now, you're going to need to be of a certain age group to have memories of a Nickelodeon television show called Guts. This show was like American Gladiators, but it was geared towards teenagers who weren't particularly athletic. While the show itself was wild and crazy, the SNES version of this was a bit of a mess. Now, in the game, you control your character as they navigate through the 6 different levels. These levels include stuff like Slam Dunk Challenge, an obstacle course, and even basic training. The ultimate goal is to beat the not-so-intimidating Argo Crag course, claim the trophy, and then complete the game. Although the animations for the game do look pretty good for its time, the music and repetitive gameplay don't hold your attention for more than 10-15 minutes at the most. And the moment you finish the game, there's never really a reason to go back and play again because it's always going to be the same 5 boring levels with the tutorial over and over again. Next up, Stanley Cup. Ah, that rhymed. So, hockey enthusiasts would agree that there's a lot of room for improvement in this game. NHL Stanley Cup aimed to capture the thrilling essence of hockey through a 3D perspective and a trailing camera. Unfortunately, the execution fell short and the results were mixed, with a few successes but more failures. Apart from the camera, there are other issues that hinder the game from being as enjoyable as it could have been. I appreciate the game's attempt to incorporate as many real-life rules as they could. Unlike some older hockey games, this one penalized you for icing the puck or making 2-line passes. Thank God they got rid of that rule. It also pays attention to proper face-off position, line changes, and penalties. The game can only be so authentic, though, because it doesn't have the official license of NHL players. They did have the 26 NHL teams at the time present in the game, but individual players on each team were not. This meant that your team consisted of anonymous clones who all looked identical, and their only identifying thing was the number on their jersey. I remember being excited for this game when I first saw it. It looked amazing. It still does. But I wasn't impressed with the constant reversing of the 3D aspect between possession of the puck. I might be just mad because I grew up playing hockey and I still love the game today, but it just was a game that was so unenjoyable. Next at number 4, Revolution X. Now, this is one of those games that when I asked a few friends about, they were divided. Some people said, yeah, it was awesome, and then a few people, including myself, said that it sucked. Most people that liked it were thinking about the arcade version or the Genesis version. On the Super Nintendo version, it's not great. You know, it is easy to move your gun, but actually hitting anything is nearly impossible for the average player. This is going to result in you dying at the hands of the weak enemies that should present no challenge, and you'd think that mouse support would make this any better, but then you'd be wrong. Button 1 doubles as both the start and fire button, and button 2 is for the CDs. Not only that, the mouse is way too sensitive. Overall, this game is just something that you wish stayed in the arcade. Oh, and also it's based around a band. You think the music would be good at least. It isn't. Next up, number 5, Bill Laimbeer's Combat Basketball. Now, I can't believe there's actually a basketball video game featuring Bill Laimbeer. Bill, if you didn't know, was a center for the Pistons back in the late 80s and early 90s, and he was known as an enforcer in those days. Now, Laimbeer was notorious for playing very dirty and relying on his talented teammates to carry the load. It's understandable that they would try and pitch a game with few or no rules and how it would suit his style, but I can't comprehend why it would end up being a sci-fi basketball game with terrible controls and a really strange overhead view that makes it almost impossible to play properly. It all boils down to hitting the opponents as much as you can while trying to hit a few layups. There are a few power-ups lying around on the court, but unless they're directly in front of you, you're better off just hitting the opponents. They're not worth going for. A very strange entry for the Super Nintendo library and a worthy member for this list. Number 6, but again, remember, not ranked, Rise of the Robots. Now, it's difficult not to feel that Rise of the Robots has been somewhat overlooked by history. Now, despite its initial promise and potential to usher in a new era of technological prowess, back when it was first announced, it generated a lot of excitement with the stunning CGI graphics and the Street Fighter style gameplay. It was highly anticipated, so much so that it was released on almost every gaming platform of that time period. However, while some of the versions were better than others, the SNES version was particularly underwhelming. The AI was embarrassingly dim-witted, the available moves were limited, and the visual impressive pre-rendered graphics lost all of their charm when they were downscaled for the Nintendo console. As a result, this game ended up being a chaotic mess and one of the weakest one-on-one fighters on the system. On a positive note, the music is pretty banging. Next up, Bebe's Kids. Now, Bebe's Kids quickly gained a reputation as one of the worst games ever made, even catching the attention of Nintendo Power. Can you imagine how terrible a game has to be for Nintendo Power to call you out? This game truly lives up to its legacy, taking bad licensed side-scrolling SNES games to a whole new level. The only thing worse than the bland visuals and awful soundtrack is actually playing it. Navigating through terrible combat, confusing levels, and a punishing time limit. Like seriously, chances are you'll see the time up screen more often than you ever see the second level. It's so bad that it's almost impressive. I remember liking this movie when I was a kid, so I looked it up on YouTube, see if it still held up to today. It does, it's still actually pretty funny, made me laugh. This game is Balls 3D, Balls 3D. During the 90s, a lot of developers attempted to create the next advanced 3D console game, and they tried to do it on the SNES. But unfortunately, most of these fell short in terms of playability. They were kind of like tech demos, testing out the waters. Among these titles, Balls 3D stands out as one of the worst due to its poor performance and terrible controls. Terrible controls. Even if the game ran smoothly and had some better controls, its visually jarring level and character designs would still make it a contender for this list, and maybe worst game of the era. The music and sound effects were weird, the hit detection just never felt right. It had to have been morbid curiosity that anyone would play this more than a handful of times. This game was balls. 3D. Next, Home Alone. Now, Home Alone's another one of those games when you look back, you're like, was this bad? Was that a bad game? And then you try it again, and you're like, yeah, it was a bad game. In the late 80s and early 90s, movie tie-ins were incredibly popular, so it's no surprise that a video game adaptation of the blockbuster film Home Alone was released. Although the SNES version was far superior in graphics compared to the NES and the Game Boy versions, the gameplay itself was incredibly boring and failed to capture the excitement of the film's thrilling storyline of a lone child defending his home against intruders. While it's expected for licensed games to prioritize profit, Home Alone feels especially rushed and insincere. It plays more like a shallow and repetitive minigame rather than a fully developed game deserving of a full price tag. Hey, have you guys ever heard that crazy movie theory that Kevin McAllister grew up to be Jigsaw? Next in, number 10, Space Ace. Now, Space Ace stands out as a prime example of poor decision making. Absolute Entertainment, the developer, were fully aware that replicating Space Ace's Dragon's Lair-like Laserdisc technology and gameplay on the SNES was impossible. Nevertheless, they attempted to create a game that closely resembles the arcade original instead of trying to pursue a completely different approach, which might have been the smarter idea. The end result is a product that can hardly be classified as a game. Seriously. Space Ace seems to have been made with the intention of looking appealing on packaging or in magazines, but it quickly unravels once the controller's in hand. The game's difficulty is surprisingly high considering its lack of engaging controls and level design. Batman Forever. Now, even during a time when most licensed video games were unplayable, Batman games always stood out as surprisingly good. That's why it's so puzzling that the developers at Probe Entertainment, who were working on Batman Forever, decided to abandon the successful formulas and create a new Batman game that can only be described as a mix of bad Donkey Kong Country and bad Mortal Kombat, with a touch of the worst beat-em-up you're ever gonna play. It should have been clear from the beginning that the motion capture technology used in this game wasn't going to work. Unfortunately, the Batman Forever team didn't do themselves any favor by using this technology in a game where you often had no idea what you were supposed to do, along with some of the most complex button combinations for simple moves. A surprisingly sad spot on the otherwise stellar Batman video game library. Race Drivin'. So the original Race Drivin' for the Atari in 1990 was a fantastic 3D arcade racer. However, the 1992 SNES port by THQ seems like it was made as a challenge to create the worst arcade port ever. The visuals in this version are incredibly choppy, causing everything around it to come to a sudden stop. Playing the game feels like having a seizure, with the deliberate intention of making you fail. The controls don't seem to care about any of your desires, resulting in one of the most frustrating driving experiences you'll ever have. Every attempt in Race Driving feels like you're drowning with no hope of success. Race Driving clearly prioritized impressive graphics and a 3D effect over creating an actually enjoyable experience. The problem is, it always looks terrible. The graphics are blocky and unappealing even by 1992 standards. The driving physics in the game are unbelievably bad, and as time has passed, the visuals have only become uglier and more depressing. The Wizard of Oz. The Super Nintendo brought us an unexpected surprise in 1993 with the release of The Wizard of Oz. It's quite peculiar because there doesn't seem to be that much information about the game online or from Turner despite its existence. You can still stumble upon it out in the wild. Unfortunately, as a traditional platformer, The Wizard of Oz falls short in many aspects. The hit detection is quite poor and the attacks are rather laughable, except for the Tin Man who stands out. Each character in the game has their own unique abilities and traits, but strangely enough, they rarely come into play. What's even more strange is that I discovered later on in many of the stages in the games, they were actually taken from the 1990 Wizard of Oz animated series by Dick, which I had no idea existed. So, we end up with a game that's a bad idea from the start, based on a movie that predates video games, and incorporates elements from an animated series that hardly anyone ever watched. T2 Judgment Day. How can one possibly secure the rights to what is arguably the best action movie ever made, and then not invest a little time and money into creating something that won't completely insult those who trusted in the title? I'm at a loss for words where they even began with this one. The driving levels are atrocious, the escort quests seem never ending, the objectives are confusing, the difficulty spikes like you feel like you're always making a mistake, and the animations and the character designs are laughable, and the action is just plain bad. It's somehow even worse than the already bad NES adaptation of the same movie. Pit Fighter. Now this one, I know we didn't rank any of them, but this one could be the #1 worst on the SNES. So Pit Fighter serves as a prime example of a Super Nintendo game that initially appears promising, but ultimately fell short upon playing it. The cover art was captivating, the graphics seemed impressive in the picture, and the arcade version garnered immense popularity, leaving many to believe that this would be an experience that you would actually enjoy. Regrettably, those fans were incorrect in their assumptions. Now this game is a technical catastrophe on all fronts, but it's the gameplay and unnecessary difficulty that inflicts a particularly agonizing experience on every retro gamer that remembers this. Even if one possessed the determination to conquer this title's nearly insurmountable foes, the absence of continues and sporadic health refills ensure that even the most skilled players would likely never reach the end of this game. And that's going to do it for this video, guys. These were 15 of the worst Super Nintendo games. Now, down in the comments, guys, let me know what your thoughts are on this. Did we hit all of them? Which ones are missing? Let me know. And, of course, thanks again for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. If you've got the time, hit that like button just so I know to keep making videos like this. Until next time, guys, take care, and I'll see you in about a week.